This is TLV1.
TLV1 Radio.
Great mixer.
I like television.
This is still V1.
This is
Tel Aviv is a beautiful city.
Great city, great radio.
TLV1.
This is TLV1.
All right, everyone, welcome to this very special Sukkot edition of Louis Live. If you're listening to me in your sukkahs, I appreciate it. We have a great show tonight. It's an hour-long special in regards to the Rumble in the Jungle, the fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. This month marks the 40th anniversary of that. And, before the show started, I was speaking to our lovely producer, Tammy, and she said, we're doing a whole hour about one sporting event? I said, yes, we are, because this sporting event is 10 Super Bowls combined plus. This event affects not only American culture, but worldwide culture, had effect on philosophy, religion, and grills. Yes, we'll talk about that as well. And on the line to discuss this event for the entire hour, he is the director of the film Split Decision. That's the story of Guerrero Rigondeaux, who is a Cuban defector boxer, became champion of the world. And, of course, he's written a book about that film as well, a Cuban boxer's journey, Guerrero Rigondeaux, from Castro's traitor to American champion. You can pick up that book on Amazon. Of course, back to the show, Bryn Jonathan Butler. Bryn, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, we're like two kids in a candy store. We've been talking for days about this very interview, and here we are. Are you excited?
I am.
All right, let's get down to business. This is a Jewish show. We're talking about money first. Both fighters in 1974 paid $5 million apiece. It was the richest sporting event of all time in regards to that. And in today's money, it'd probably be $25-30 million to give people a perspective. Don King, who was little well-known at that time, was able to get that money. I want to know how. You interviewed the man.
Don King got it from the dictator Mobutu.
Yes, he did.
Directly. He said, in terms of publicity, this is a hell of a lot cheaper than a war.
Right.
And Mobutu did hook, line, and sinker and put up the money, and everything just took off from there. I mean, King originally, this is how he really got into American life, American culture, was by getting Ali to agree to a fight, signing for $5 million, and then he went over to Foreman and said, look, I've got Ali's name on his signature is on a contract, and Foreman said, okay, signed it. Now all he needed was $10 million because he didn't have a cent to actually pay either of these guys. So King, as was well documented in When We Were Kings, just had the cojones to go to anybody to get it and put forward a convincing argument to this ruthless dictator, and he was off to the races.
All right, and before Don King was in this spotlight, he had killed two people. He went to jail. One of the times he only served 6 months. I don't know how that happened. But basically, this guy was a thug, and thanks to this fight, he is the Don King that we know in the public. The big hair, the smile, only in America. That happened because of this fight, right?
Absolutely. This fight launched him, and he was so shrewd to not just launch. When We Were Kings originally was a film dedicated exclusively to the musical performers who went over to Zaire to perform. That's what Leon Gass was doing. It was such an assembly of amazing African-American talent. James Brown and
B.B. King.
B.B. King, just a slew of the biggest names. I think Bill Withers was over there. And after the fight was delayed, Leon just kept filming what was going on with the fight. What's happened? Where's it going? Is it going to come back? And all of that. And that became the substance of the behind the scenes that he got for what many consider the greatest sports documentary ever made.
It did win the 1996 Oscar, and we'll talk about it later on. I want to go back to the evil dictator of Zaire Matubu, and to give some people perspective, he apparently would torture people at random. He was very paranoid and suspicious, and in the film, there's a story that he lined up the top 1,000 criminals, what have you. He had his soldiers randomly execute about 100 of them just to instill fear that this was his country and no one was going to mess with them. Is that true?
Yeah, that was Norman Mailer's account, was that the crime rate in Zaire was ferociously high, and to try and create the impression that it was a stable environment for the world to descend upon. Yeah, he arbitrarily picked 1,000 people in some of the worst prisons and just executed them all. Just to demonstrate that as a dictator, there was, no oversight or accountability for anything he wanted to happen. And consequently, Mailer described Zaire, and I think George Plimpton did as well, as one of the safest places on earth while the fight was going on. So you can question the morality of it, but in terms of the efficacy of the move, it worked brilliantly.
And I'll tell you, we could do hours on my next question, but just in a few minutes, people will listen to the show might say, why in the world did they put a fight in a country that had such an evil dictator? And I could counter it and say, that evil dictator visited Richard Nixon in 1973 at the White House. America did a lot of business with him, didn't they?
Well, I mean, America doesn't have a problem doing business with dictators. Many of the people who become our enemies one day were our friends before. Rumsfeld was shaking the hand of Saddam Hussein. Bin Laden was financed by America during the revolution in Afghanistan against the Russians. So, no, it's not like it was the first time it's ever happened. We're quite fickle in that regard.
Yes, indeed. Again, speaking with Bryn Jonathan Butler. All right, going to the two participants in the fight, I want to speak about George Foreman first, even though he lost the fight. When I say George Foreman, most people listening to the show will say, oh, that's the guy who made the grills. But before he was the guy that made the grills, he was 40-0, 37 knockouts, considered invincible. And one of the reasons of his invincibility was his victory over Joe Frazier in 1973 to get his first reign as champion. We're going to play that clip right now. You're going to listen to the voice of the late, great Howard Cosell in this clip. Let's take it away, please.
1968 in the Mexico City Arena. A quick left from George. Another. Frazier is down for the 5th time in this fight. 5th time. 3 times in the first round, twice in the second. McCanny checked his senses. Checked Frazier's senses. Right. It's target practice for George Foreman. It is target practice. Frazier is ready to go again. Joe is standing. There he goes. 3 times. 3 times. The fight is stopped. No.
All right. Arthur McCanny mercifully finally stopped that fight after the 6th knockdown of Joe Frazier. You can hear in the crowd Angelo Dundee and Ali's entourage saying stop the fight. There was concern Frazier was going to actually get killed by big, strong George Foreman, right?
Oh, I mean, it was unimaginable, even to Foreman. Foreman described that when they were brought together at the center of the ring for referee's instructions, that he was glad that Frazier was glaring at him in the eyes because his knees were shaking. Frazier was, not far off from what Tyson was in his heyday in terms of where the public held him in esteem as just a destroyer. And Foreman was thought to be fighting tomato cans, and here, just lays to waste Frazier in a manner that was just unimaginable, especially after what Frazier had done to Ali. So you can't exaggerate what the effect was of that performance.
And Foreman then went on to defend his title a few times. During that span of the early 70s, he did have some issues keeping his temper control when it came to women. A couple domestic violence issues. He had to pay $30,000 out to a woman. So Foreman, before he was the born-again preacher and the smiling guy who sold the grills, had some problems with that.
Yeah, I think the easiest way, again, there are a lot of parallels with Tyson. He was just the most menacing heavyweight that I think people had seen since Sonny Liston in his prime. He was an incredibly dark character, which is so difficult to conceptualize now, isn't it? Because Frazier just seems like the most welcome face for corporate America, and yet at that time, just sinister, came from a horrible, horrible background in Houston, and just was looking to inflict his past on everybody around him. I mean, even his trainer looked petrified to be around him. So, incredible character.
Grew up in Houston's 5th Ward, very impoverished city is an understatement, and he talked about he had a desire to kill people in the ring. That was one of his goals, right?
Yeah, he's just ruthlessly scary guy. Unbelievably intimidating at that point.
And he was 8-1 going against Muhammad Ali. That was the betting odds. And we're going to play a clip. This is George Foreman talking about his thoughts going into the Ali fight. He gave this interview in the 90s, but he did recall when his thoughts before he faced Ali in 1974.
All suddenly, everybody I hit, if I missed them almost, they would be knocked out. So I thought I was the toughest thing ever invented. I was going to be the best heavyweight that ever existed. One punch of mine was equal to 20 of any other heavyweight champ, I thought. So getting up to Zaire, getting ready to fight Muhammad Ali, I thought this will be a matter of just a little exercise. I'll probably knock him out in 3 rounds, 2, 3, maybe 3.5 rounds. That was the most confidence I've had in my whole life.
It's interesting.
Now, I want to know this. I thought about this so many times. I watched this fight 100 times at least, not kidding. If George Foreman wins this fight, he goes to 41-0. He had beaten the top contenders in Joe Frazier and Ken Norton. I don't know who else could have stopped him. Would he have gone down as the greatest heavyweight of all time instead of Ali by most accounts?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, you put his highlight reel against anybody in history, you'd say, well, Joe Louis was barely 200 pounds. Foreman would have towered over a Joe Louis, towered over a Jack Dempsey, much bigger than Jack Johnson. So, yeah, I mean, we're talking about a guy who in his 40s was still not just competitive, but I mean was winning fights against the heavyweight elites going into his mid-40s. So him in his prime after, winning the Olympic gold medal and just a human wrecking ball, and even Foreman's record today, I mean, doesn't have many losses at all, and faced everybody. So I think he could have easily had another 10 years as just possibly going undefeated.
And it's talked about, there are definitely myths that when he punched concrete, he would dent pillars. And in the movie When We Were Kings, when Foreman punched the punching bag, Ali did not want to look at it. That's what the movie says. You interviewed Leon Gass. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the heavy bag after he finished a few rounds with it. I mean, it was dented. It was a dent that it wouldn't go back to its original form. It was this watermelon gaping hole to one side where he'd be swinging these wild punches. Many people described his punching power as the equivalent of going to visit the dentist. Just ruthlessly powerful puncher. So, yeah, I don't know that there's ever been a heavyweight puncher who's had as much regard in terms of what they could do with their fists. I mean, he never lost it. Even, almost approaching 50, he was still a devastating knockout puncher.
All right, now let's break down the fight because I'm setting this up to show people how invincible he was. 8-1 favorite. He was 25 years old, the prime of his life. Ali was 32, had come off 2 losses, was not given much of a chance. And what's famously documented is he did the rope-a-dope. He tired Foreman out, and Foreman was exhausted, gets a knockout in the 8th round. I want to know, again, you interviewed Leon Gass, was that Ali's plan all along? Because pre-fight hype, he said he was going to dance the whole fight, not go into a corner and take the punches. And do you think Ali made this decision right before the fight or before training camp even started?
I think it's very possible. I mean, Ali was such a brilliant tactician mentally, and getting under the skin of all the fighters he faced. I think in a lot of ways you can see that almost every major fight that he had, he found a way in to sort of break down emotionally all the major guys, be it Floyd Patterson, Sonny Liston. He pretended to be insane. And Patterson, he was going after him with, the whole religious context, Muslim versus Christians. So I think Ali recognized after the Frazier defeat and coming off of his layoff for the Vietnam protests that he was not the same fighter that he was, and had to demonstrate, what we didn't really know was that he could take a punch better than any heavyweight in history. So I think he found and invented his own method to sort of crack somebody who most people at that time thought was totally unbeatable. And that's not a strategy that most people could ever employ, even if they tried to with a great puncher. especially such a young, menacing puncher. So, yeah, I think Ali definitely had it in mind, and you can see even his own corner had no idea what he was doing. So
That's right.
I think the fact that he stuck with it, it demonstrates that, yeah, there was a lot of method in what he was doing.
Throughout the fight, Angelo Dundee, you could hear him saying, "Get off the ropes, Ali, move, get off the ropes." So he didn't agree with the strategy. We're going to play a clip now. This is Ali training for the Foreman fight. He is prophetically saying that Foreman's going to get tired in the 7th round. He's talking about a longer fight than expected. He's talking about how quick he is and he's the greatest and all that good stuff. Here is the clip of Ali training in Zaire for the fight against George Foreman.
Sticking. Keep dancing and sticking. Sidestepping. Bouncing off the ropes. Dancing and sticking. Beat him all night. Tire him out by 7 rounds.
Right.
He won't be so game in 7 rounds.
Right.
Tire him out.
Bring him home.
Get my legs ready. I'll be dancing all night.
Right.
Fastest heavyweight of all time.
Right. Right.
Fastest with the rope. The stage is set for me to be ranked as the greatest of all time. Ain't no way they can have no excuses after this. I got them cornered. I got the world cornered.
All right, and the stage was set, and because of that victory, most boxing experts will consider him the greatest, or at least in the top 3. I want to know, Bryn Jonathan Butler, if Ali loses that fight, where is his place in history, and would he have retired? Howard Cosell thought he would lose the fight and then retire. What do you think would have happened had Muhammad Ali lost that night in the Congo?
Well, I don't think he would have retired. Ali, like most of the great fighters of all time, was being bled dry financially from the Nation of Islam, from a massive entourage. So really until right after his career was over, when he had almost nothing and sold his name for merchandising, he was always in need for money. He had to stay in there and keep going. It wasn't just a question of pride, even though I think certainly his pride was enormous. So I think on that side also, he loved to fight. He absolutely loved being the center of attention. So
Yes. Yeah,
where would he have been had he lost that fight? I think he would have tried to come right back and get a rematch with Foreman or tussle with all of the great heavyweights of that era. I mean, Ali ducked nobody. And even after he came off from the layoff, he was fighting tough guys. Oscar Bonavena, Jerry Quarry. He was not taking easy fights. The Ken Norton fights that he had were, devastating in terms of the damage he took. So I just, it's hard to imagine anybody displacing him from the top 3 from what he was in the early manifestation as champion. That guy, putting the early Ali who fought Liston against anybody in history, too smart, too fast, too brave, really, I think, not to beat anybody. But post layoff, you still have a guy who's just, inspired. I think inspired us in a way that the early Ali never did. We had no idea of the intestinal fortitude that he had inside. We saw him as a tremendous athletic specimen, brilliant tactician, but that chin, we didn't know that chin was there as well until post layoff.
Yeah, even in the first Liston fight, he wanted to quit in the middle because Sonny Liston had put dirt or something in his eyes. He would talk about quitting. Angelo Dundee said, "You're not going to quit, go out there." The Ali of 74 just never quit. In the 70s, he just never quit, and that was something different about him. We're going to play a clip. This clip is the final round of the fight. I want everyone to pay attention very closely to Bob Sheridan's voice describing what happens at the end of the round, because that will key in to my next question to Bryn. Take it away, please.
30 seconds left in round 8. Very even fight. Ali, a sneaky right hand. Another sneaky right hand. This time he works over the shoulder of Foreman. It's the combination. 3, 4, 5,
You can almost barely hear Bob Sheridan's voice over the roar of the crowd in Zaire. Now we're going to talk about why George Foreman lost, especially conspiracy theory aspects. Bryn Jonathan Butler, you hear Bob Sheridan say Foreman gets up to the knee at 8. He beat the 10 count. It's obvious. He stood up at 8. Zach Clayton called him out, said it was a knockout. Did Zach Clayton make a mistake there?
I don't think so. If the person looks defenseless, if the person doesn't look like it's safe for them to continue, the referee is fully within his rights and discretion to call the fight over. So I don't see much that's contentious with that stoppage. Foreman definitely looked like, Ali was coming on. Ali, it wasn't like it was a lucky onslaught that dropped Foreman. I think he was fully capable of continuing what he did to drop Foreman. So I think it was a very reasonable stoppage. What do you think?
Well, it was at the end of the 8th round, so he would have had a minute to rest. Maybe he would have regained his composure. I do doubt it, but I always wondered why he stopped it at 8. But that is a pretty good explanation on your account. Let's talk about some of the wild conspiracy theories, soap opera type of stuff George Foreman said. George Foreman claimed at one point in his book, God in My Corner, that his trainer, Dick Sadler, poisoned him. He put medicine in his water, and that's why Foreman was tired. What are your thoughts about that, Bryn Jonathan Butler?
Well, I think if you look at his punch output for that fight, boy, what would he have been like if he wasn't poisoned? Because, the amount of energy that he expended throughout that fight was incredible. I'm amazed at the stamina he had. And this is a guy, you have to remember, you watch a lot of heavyweight fights. These are huge men. And Foreman was throwing, 50, 60 punches around throughout that fight. And every punch had intention to knock Ali out. So I don't see any say. It wasn't like he was holding back or looked fatigued for the first 7 rounds. It's just after 6 rounds of that kind of output, a lot of people who haven't been involved in boxing themselves, I myself have trained a lot of fighters, and you get somebody who is an extremely well-conditioned athlete who's never done boxing before, a couple rounds can leave them tuckered out.
Yeah.
So I think the conditioning of Foreman was phenomenal for that fight.
And whatever it's worth, Foreman fired Dick Sadler, replaced him with Gil Clancy. So that's how much he believed that Dick Sadler had something to do with his loss. Now, I want to go back a little bit because the fight was originally scheduled for the middle of September. It was delayed 6 weeks because of a cut to Foreman in sparring. And people have this idea that Ali loved being in Africa and that he was back home. But according to the film, When We Were Kings, it sounded like both Ali and Foreman wanted to leave Zaire and that perhaps Matubu suggested they'd stay. Again, you interviewed Leon Gass. Were the fighters forced to be in Africa against their will by the evil dictator?
Well, apparently there was definitely pressure put upon them that, once you get there, what liberties you think you have are a little bit up for grabs. So I certainly do think there was pressure for everybody to stay there and ensure that the fight came off, because I think it could have been disastrous in terms of publicity had the fight not materialized back in Zaire and gone somewhere else. They were there because the money was there. So if somebody else would have put up money, it could have gone anywhere else. The Thrill in Manila was another situation where you had domestically massive problems going on in the Philippines. And, the optics of that fight looked bad in terms of trying to help a dictator look good. I think there was definitely pressure.
All right. There you go. How much, I guess we'll never know, but at the end of the day, the fight happened, Ali victorious. And this is a part I want everyone to listen to because I said at the beginning of the show that this fight had an influence on the movies we see. The original plan, Don King thought George Foreman was going to win. It's pretty obvious. His original plan was for George Foreman to fight a guy named Chuck Wepner. Since Foreman lost, he decided instead to have Ali fight Chuck Wepner, a 15-round battle of a journeyman fighter against the greatest ever. Some guy named Sylvester Stallone saw that fight and wrote this movie called Rocky. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. Bryn Jonathan Butler, if this fight in the Congo doesn't happen, does that mean we don't see any Rocky movies?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely not. Stallone, I mean, it's not just a rumor that Stallone took that script. He had to pay off Chuck Wepner because the parallels were so obvious in adopting that story of that great fight. Wepner dropped Ali with kind of a slip, but it was definitely on the heels of a punch, and that got the ball rolling for Stallone. What happens if a nobody drops the greatest? And Apollo Creed couldn't be more part and parcel lifted from Ali. So yeah, I think very likely you're right. That was the entire impetus to Rocky, and who knows what would have happened if it would have happened at a different time, and certainly with a different opponent. Chuck Wepner was an absolute nobody, so I don't see Rocky unless just the timing.
Yeah, about $3 billion would have not been made by those Rocky movies. And it is so funny because Stallone seems like this all-American guy. He basically stole everything for those movies. Even Rocky III, when Mr. T loses to Stallone, is based on this fight in Zaire, the rope-a-dope. That's what Ali used to beat Foreman. Mr. T was clearly George Foreman, and Stallone used that. Bunch of things he stole. Even the run up the steps, that famous run, was originally done by Chuck Wepner, correct?
It was Joe Frazier, actually.
Joe
Frazier ran up those steps, and you can go one further, that Rocky V, where Tommy Morrison stepped in to basically play the Mike Tyson story with a Don King character. And again, you just had exactly him stealing the headlines of the most famous fighter out there and fictionalizing it and transposing a white fighter in the place of Tyson, knocking everybody out, and then being stolen away from Rocky and American Purity to go with the evil forces of Don King. So, yeah, Stallone has never been too shy about where he gets his quote-unquote inspiration from for a lot of his stories.
George Washington Duke, everyone. That was Don King in Rocky V. People want to see that movie. It's a terrible movie, but nevertheless, it made someone money, so that's good there. Now, I want to talk about Ali's racism, because for some reason, Ali gets a pass. He's considered like a saint. He met with George W. Bush in the White House, and George W. Bush gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, all this great stuff. This is a clip we're going to play on the Parkinson Show. It was a show in England where Ali talks about Jew and Gentile and white people and all that stuff. Let's take that away.
All Jews and Gentiles are devils. Ali repeated. Well, that proves what I says, because that includes you and the blacks.
Jews and Gentiles.
And the Greek word for Gentiles means non-Jews. Jews and non-Jews.
I'm talking about the Bible. What's in the Bible?
But that in the Bible it says Jews and Gentiles. And Gentiles.
No, the question was, you said some are good, some are tried.
Yeah. Now, if you say that all blacks are devils as well as all whites,
no, blacks are not devils.
Because that's what that
says. What if black? Who have we lynched? Who have we raped?
No.
Who have we slaved?
Oh, thousands of people in the Congo and in Africa. I'm not against blacks. I'm saying blacks and whites, we're all awful, maybe.
But everything black people do wrong come from you.
To what I
Drinking,
just said about
smoking, prostitution, homosexuality, lying, stealing, gambling.
Cannibalism.
It all come from you.
You know, there's things on your side too.
I don't know about cannibalism.
Look, the thing I was just saying was that I'm not against what you say that some white people do. I'm just trying to save you from some of your own quotes. That the point is that you said that all white people are devils.
Elijah,
now, if you
I didn't say that.
No,
Elijah Muhammad teaches us, God told him that all
God
white people are
devils.
devils.
Because the thing
God
is,
wasn't wrong, because I ain't seen no good ones yet.
No.
And I've traveled all over the country.
No, the thing is that you
I haven't
said...
seen one good.
Wow, I don't even know where to begin with that. I think people, for some reason, forgot he said that, chose not to remember it. I don't even know where to begin. I want to start first with, at the end of the day, was Ali a puppet of the Nation of Islam, or did he really believe that all white people are the devils and there are no good ones?
I think there's no question that Ali was incredibly so a puppet of the Nation of Islam. And you have to look at the substance of what the Nation of Islam was in relation to the legend of Ali. Ali met with the Ku Klux Klan because the Ku Klux Klan and the Nation of Islam had a very similar agenda in terms of segregation. So you think Ali is hailed as a civil rights advocate and hero, but the Nation of Islam's posture was very much anti-civil rights. They were anti-Martin Luther King, tremendously misogynist, were a lot of Ali's principles. And again, the hypocrisy of Ali. Ali conduct the Vietnam War on a religious basis. However, he was a serial philanderer of every woman he ever married, had, a village of children out of wedlock. So in that instance, you see, what was the sincerity behind his religious devotion? I mean, when it was convenient, when it wasn't, he did what he wanted to do. A lot of his famous quotes were spoon-fed to him from the Nation of Islam. Most famously, the Viet Cong never called me the N-word. That's not Ali speaking. That's on record as coming from the Nation of Islam, a spokesman for him to deliver. And let's also remember when Malcolm X stood up to the Nation of Islam, pointing out that Elijah Muhammad had several children out of wedlock with secretaries, which is true. Ali's response to that about his best friend, Malcolm X, was let him die. He deserves to die for daring to speak out against Elijah Muhammad. So threw his best friend under the bus, which apparently is one of the big regrets of Ali's life. So I think he deserves to get all the accolades for the courage he showed in the ring. But if you look at his courage in standing up to a lot of forces outside the ring, and a lot of his, the racial rhetoric against Joe Frazier, calling him an Uncle Tom and a white man's champion, and this is a man who supported him financially while Ali had no money because the Nation of Islam robbed him blind. It's just abhorrent behavior. And Ali's always gotten a pass because I think we just as a culture love him. And there are many such celebrities who get a pass. John Lennon was a serial woman hitter by his own admission during an interview with Jan Werner of Rolling Stone. Said, yeah, I always hit women. I'm a woman hitter. How often do we hear that raised? Where every time you hear these athletes with spousal abuse or hitting women in various situations, Lennon's name has never floated around because we go, ooh, wait, he's give peace a chance. He's imagined and all of that. So we're very selective. And basically, once we really like a person, we want to just focus on the stuff that we like about them and exclude the rest. And I think we've been very selective with Ali. But of course, I mean, we're talking about him now for an hour because he inspires such wonderful conversation. So we don't want to undermine that, I think.
Again, speak with Bryn Jonathan Butler, the book, A Cuban Boxer's Journey, Guillermo Rigondo, From Castro's Traitor to American Champion. That's on Amazon. Everyone should pick up a copy of that. What I also find interesting with Ali and the Black Muslims, when we were playing that clip, the people in the studio, they were laughing when they were listening to him. Somehow he made that funny. And I want to know if we took those words and put it in Mike Tyson or someone that scared us, if it would have been viewed the same way. I always find it fascinating. Him, Charles Barkley, had this gift of saying really offensive things and people laugh. How was he able to do that?
I want to go back to John Lennon with that. John Lennon, in a number of his interviews, used the F-word epithet against homosexuals very casually, as well as confessing to hitting women. Where's the outrage in terms of his legacy with both of those? Being, vehemently homophobic in discussing his former manager, Brian Epstein, and hitting his first wife. People, for the most part, just don't care. They just disregard it. And I think, I just think there are certain people out there that we just give a pass because we like them, and we, as you say with Ali, he's just so charming that he just seems to get away with everything in a way that, Tyson, we want to brand as this evil animal, and everything that's disgusting about him has nothing to do with us being willing to pay so much money to watch him do all of those things. It's him. With Ali, I think we want to see the best of ourselves in him. So that's why I think he's accorded that kind of hypocrisy without us ever calling him on it, because I think we ourselves as a culture are entirely hypocritical. Does that make sense?
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good explanation for it. I think that is pretty well said, that we have a tendency to be hypocritical. If you look at what we're into and what we preach, it doesn't always line up the same. And speaking of that concept, I always find it interesting with people like Ali or Barry Bonds, people that will say they hate white people, for some reason always hang around white people. Like Barry Bonds' wife and his mistress and his best friends were white. Ali's trainer, Dundee, white. Freddie Pacheco they were all white. There were more white people in his entourage than most fighters. So how did I know Ali was asked about that. He said, I do business with them. They're not my friends. That's the way he explained it. But if you look later on, he did call them friends. So how did Ali go through that in his mind to say in public, white people are the devil, but then have white people help him become champion of the world?
Well, I think if you look at Ali in terms of the substance of him, a great book for listeners to check out is called Ghosts of Manila, written by Mark Cram. And Mark Cram was following very closely with Ali for the better part of a decade, following him. And his observations in that book are to say that the genius of Ali is that he's kind of a blank canvas. He was not a thoughtful person. He was not introspective. He was not curious. So he would allow writers to really fill in that canvas with themselves and project relevant issues and project him as not just a boxing icon, but a civil rights leader, and why he was so vital to his time and the era and the causes of, the incredibly turbulent America, that suddenly Ali was fighting for everybody, and there was so much, where I want to go, just always framing him in the middle of every major source of strife that was in America. Suddenly he was always fighting the good fight, and people had him as an advocate and as a symbol for what their cause was. Because who wouldn't want to be associated with such a beautiful person and such a charismatic person? So he was very convenient. And I think you can kind of see on the other side how Mike Tyson is somebody similar for his own era. Tyson never really seemed to be sure who he was or represented, so he could suddenly be a symbol for everything that was negative in his era. And boxers have always been very handy for that. I think Floyd Mayweather is very emblematic for our time right now, where everything is money. If I make money, who cares if it was a good fight or a boring fight or people feel ripped off? As long as I make out, everything's okay, and I'm the highest paid athlete in sports, so it must be good. It must be compelling, and it must be worth your time and money to invest in what I'm doing. But I think a lot of people feel ripped off. That's we need to go a little deeper. And I think if we go deeper with Ali, I think he was always a puppet for people. I don't think he was ever quite sure what he was doing outside of the ring. Inside the ring, I don't think there's anybody who's been better in the history of that sport. But outside, I think he was always trying to sort of grasp for what it means. There must be this tremendous purpose behind it that it can be tied into bigger things. And I don't think he was ever really able to grapple with those things. So he let other people do it for him, and that was shrewd. That was a very shrewd strategy.
Yeah, I like that point also because every group seemed to think Ali was on their side. The liberals liked him, anti-war people, oh, he's one of us. And then if you're a black Muslim, no, he's one of us. And if you're even conservative, he met with Gerald Ford in the White House. So he's an all-American. And they just kind of took him with whatever group they wanted. I think a big reason for the renaissance in Ali in the past 15 years is the Will Smith movie. And the movie, as we know, guys, that study Ali was not 100% accurate, especially the line of the Viet Cong never called me the N-word. In the movie, it looks like he thought of it, but as we know, it was spoon-fed to him. What bothered you about the Will Smith Ali movie? Any particular things that stuck out and said, no, that's not what happened?
Well, I just think it's an example. I think Ali is kind of unfilmable. As charismatic as a Will Smith is as a performer, all you realize is just how lackluster it is not to see the genuine article. Ali was a much better artist than any filmmaker could be in trying to depict his life or to comment on his life. You're just aware of just missing the real guy and feeling envy for being there at the time that Ali was creating this. Many actors, I remember, I think it's Rod Steiger in When We Were Kings, or perhaps it was from a different documentary on Ali that said if you took just Ali's performance against George Foreman in terms of improvisation to come up with the rope-a-dope, you'd say he was the greatest improvisational actor who ever lived. So I think there's an interesting parallel there with somebody like Marlon Brando. And before you were saying, how do these people get away with saying awful things? One of the things that always intrigued me with Marlon Brando was that he was quite vocal early on in an incredibly homophobic culture of the 1950s to say, yeah, I'm bisexual, I've been with other men, and nobody seemed to care. Whereas you have celebrities going into the 1980s hiding the fact that they were gay, Rock Hudson or whatever, where it would be the death knell of their career to admit it. But because Brando is Brando, it's, nothing is going to define him.
Yeah,
nothing is going to make him fade,
Yeah, and also, just real quick about Brando, I mean, at the Larry King Show live, he said that Jews control Hollywood and they're bad Jews, and be like, well, look, he's the Godfather, whatever. He's an old man, whatever. But he clearly said that live in front of Larry King, who's Jewish himself. After this fight, Ali went on to fight Joe Frazier, as you talked about, Thriller Manila for the third time. He fought Ken Norton in Yankee Stadium for the third time, then fought some tomato cans, and there was never a rematch between Foreman and Ali, which obviously is interesting because the fight produced so much money and so much history and all these things. The theory is that this was a guy that Ali ducked. The second time around, Ali would have been 34, 35 if there was a rematch. Foreman also didn't fight at all in 1975. He had to regain himself after that loss. What were your thoughts, or what are your thoughts about, at the end of the day, why there wasn't a rematch?
The stars were not aligned. That stuff happens in boxing. Ali was off and running. It's amazing to think just how far he kept going. I mean, fighting until 1980. And as I mentioned before, just how much money he needed to stay afloat, to keep his entourage afloat. So boxing is not a very well-oiled machine when it comes to the fights that lined up. I mean, I think you can divide the world, and especially boxing, into two categories of, just haywire mix-ups that allow for things to happen, and conspiracies. And I think for the most part, stuff happens by accident. We get lucky with stuff working out far more than people are able to come together and through cooperation make things happen. And I just wanted to come back to that Marlon Brando quote that you mentioned. You're absolutely right what he said about Jews control Hollywood, but that was in the context of him saying that Hollywood has a responsibility to the Jews to depict them and their plight with a lot more honesty than Hollywood has traditionally done. It was not an anti-Semitic, like where he was going with that. It was more saying, like with World War II during the Holocaust, that the Jews who were in positions of power in Hollywood at that time were not depicting it. Were not depicting the horrors that were going on. They were going more to escapism of the Wizard of Oz and
Disney
that kind
movies,
of thing, because they didn't want attention in America going to the fact that a lot of Jewish refugees were running Hollywood at that time. So I think that was more where Brando was going. It was not to attack Jews for being Jewish. It was more to say, why aren't you telling your stories more so that there's more understanding of the plight of Israel and Jews in America? So I just wanted to point, because I was very curious about that too. I thought, oh God, Brando is just this anti-Semitic jerk, but I think there was more to it than that.
All right, there we go. So the Godfather may rest in peace if he's listening to this program. I apologize. I did not know that, and I thank Bryn for bringing that to my attention. See, this show, it goes a lot of places, but always comes back to Israel somehow, because that's where broadcasting from. and also,
I'm not saying he did. He probably said a lot of dumb things about them, but I'm just saying I looked that up at the time, and Brando was a very thoughtful person, and certainly was no enemy of a pile of Jewish friends that he had. So I just think he was more candid than we're used to seeing on those kind of programs. I mean, I think he was very unguarded, but where he was going was very much, I think, a pro-Jewish statement. Just attacking more the heads of those institutions for their neglect of Jewish issues. So.
Yeah, and we've seen that even in recent times. You could argue over the summer with the war in Gaza, but that's, again, a whole other show on a different time. Again, we're speaking with Bryn Jonathan Butler, his book, A Cuban Boxer's Journey, Guillermo Regano, From Castro's Trader to American Champion. In the book, by the way, there's a story Bryn tells about of the Jew Sports Radio press pass. You have to read the book to find about that, but it is very interesting. Now, we talked a lot about Ali. I want to talk about the loser of the fight, because in many ways he became the winner, and we'll discuss that. George Foreman. after the fight, again, as I mentioned, layoff in 75. He then, 76, great victory over Joe Frazier and Ron Lyle, worked his way up, number one contender. He then loses a fight in very hot circumstances, and he thought he died, and then he went to hell, and then Jesus pulled him out, and he became a born-again Christian. And from that period, he didn't fight for about 10 years. I want to know, because you interviewed the man, that period of time, he seemed to still have struggles, financial struggles, a couple of divorces. His kids were taken away from him. He went out and had to take his kids. So if you just tell us a bit about that period of time where he didn't fight, about 1978 to 1988, that period.
Well, I would recommend to all your listeners to go on YouTube immediately if you haven't seen it before and watch George Foreman versus Ron Lyle, which is...
Oh, fantastic fight. Fight of the year.
It is unbelievable. I mean, it is Godzilla versus King Kong in terms of the size of these guys, the punching power, and they are both falling over like buildings over and over and over again. It is.
Yeah, there are more knockdowns in that fight than you see. There are more knockdowns in that fight than you'll see in a few years. I mean, seriously, it was incredible. And Howard Cosell also did a great job, as always. He was excited. But yes, that was the fight of the year in 1976, and people should watch it after the show, of course.
Absolutely. Sure. So, yeah, I think Foreman was really struggling to find his own identity after Ali. And we're talking about the psychology of Ali in the ring. Ali was saying to him the whole time, you're fighting God. And I hope you're not getting tired, which Foreman certainly was. And I think he stole the only identity that Foreman really had, which was of this dark, menacing heavyweight champion. Suddenly that was gone, and he had no idea who he was. And when I interviewed Foreman at his house, his mansion, he made a real point. Well, he made a couple of points that were interesting. One is that his son, George V, told me, be careful about asking about the past. He's touchy about the past. And as I tried to sort of delve back a little bit, not to confront him, but to go back to, just his great legacy, it was really uncomfortable for him to admit that, some of my great fights were 40 years ago. I think that Foreman really struggles with that duality of that dark side that he has to his nature and the man that he became. He found religion after the Jimmy Young fight, and stuck with that as was he a pastor? I want to get the proper term.
I think he was, they call him the punching preacher, so I think it's a minister.
So a minister. So he was a minister. He had a congregation, and that's one of the things that Foreman does that doesn't get a lot of publicity is he's donated enormous amounts of money to the Boys and Girls Club. And as somebody who's actually met his children, I have to say, these are some of the most well-behaved, well-adjusted people I've ever met. I mean, he has really incredible kids, and he was very generous to let me into his house to talk about his life, talk about, we were discussing Teofilo Stevenson, somebody that he said was probably the greatest fighter of the 1970s. So it was a real treat to be able to meet him and have time with him. But I had the sense that he wants to focus on the positive now. And I think he's been in that place for a long time. With the Foreman Grill, obviously, you had, there's an item that's out there that does a good job, but it just needs to have the right name attached to it. And that's where Foreman went with it. Foreman stuck his signature on that grill and gave his name to promoting it and got in front of the cameras with infomercial and shined that incredible smile that we didn't know he had. And you have maybe the greatest huckster that America's ever produced to sell. What is it? It's a little grill, and Foreman ended up, I think, selling his share in that grill for $125 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. And as Jim Lampley said, that the fight when he won against Michael Moore, called the biggest prize money fight ever. Because of that victory, he was able to get the George Foreman grill going. We're going to play a clip. This fight is in 1994, November, when George Foreman regained the heavyweight title against Michael Moore. He was a 10-1 underdog, and he was 45 years old. And we're going to play that clip. Listen very carefully to what Jim Lampley said. He is being broadcasted right by Gil Clancy, one of Former's trainers. Let's go ahead, please.
I have to give him all the credit in the world, but again, he's a 45-year-old man in a young man's game. But look at that competitive spirit coming out now.
Straight right hand landing for Foreman. He's had a pretty good round here in number 10.
Again, Atlas didn't counter. Atlas, here we go again with the Atlas. Michael Moore is down.
Goes Moore on a right hand. An unbelievably close-in right hand shot.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
It happened. It happened.
All right, it happened, the famous call from Jim Lampley. And while that was going on, as Lampley talked about later, Foreman went to his quarter and knelt. He was in prayer. And that fight was kind of the reverse, where he kind of rope-a-doped a little bit Michael Moore. He was losing that fight horrendously through 9 rounds. In the 10th, kind of lured Moore into standing in front of him through a 1-2, and that was pretty much all she wrote.
I think it was a complete fluke. I mean, I give full credit to Foreman, but I mean, honestly, as you say, if anybody watches that fight, I mean, all anybody really knows about that fight now is that knockout punch, that 1-2, and then Foreman said, "Oh, I was setting him up the whole fight for the one." Well, he doesn't have anything else to throw. Foreman was just moving around like a milk truck with 3 wheels, and as he veers closer and closer, here comes the 1-2, and yeah, Moore got caught, fought a stupid fight. But I mean, where's Michael Moore today? I mean,
there's nobody now.
Nowhere now. But I mean, he, at that time, fought some brilliant fights against Holyfield. Was this devastating puncher in lower weight classes. Fought Foreman pretty dumb. But I mean, Foreman had stood up to some great fighters. I mean, gave Ali a good fight. Was looking for Tyson after Tyson got out of prison, was looking for Riddick Bowe. Foreman wasn't ducking anybody. Brilliant fight again for your listeners to check out on YouTube is his demolishing of Jerry Cooney, which I believe was Cooney's last fight, but
it was brutal.
Finish to that fight.
Yeah. That uppercut he threw, I could still see it. And the Cortez was about to stop the fight, and Foreman's like, no, I want to hit him one more time with my right. Boom. I mean, it was amazing that Cooney is not more damaged than he was from that. You're right about Foreman in that he fought Evander Holyfield to the distance at the age of 40. And the fluke thing, going to Michael Moore, I mean, Michael Moore is undefeated, and he was... who knows what would happen had he won that fight, as Teddy Atlas talked about. And Teddy Atlas had a lot of criticism for Foreman as far as morality, as far as him being a con. He did not think that Foreman was this preacher smiley type, that was an act to make him seem friendly, to get fans, to get money. Again, you interviewed him. You say that he's a nice guy, but do you understand why Teddy Atlas would call him a con man?
Well, I absolutely do. I also think that Teddy Atlas, talk about calling the kettle black, I think Teddy Atlas is a tremendous con man. He's easily the rudest person I've ever dealt with in the sport, bar none. Foreman was incredibly courteous, generous with his time, and as I say, meeting his children, he seems to have invested enough in his kids to create really wonderful people. That being said, you do get the feeling with Foreman when you spend time with him that behind the facade that he's created of this new identity in that second phase of his career is all of that darkness still lurking from where he came from. I'll give you an example. While we were talking with him, I was with another person who was reporting on the Frazier fight versus Foreman in Jamaica, where Don King famously went from Frazier's side of the ring over to Foreman's with the new champion getting in his limo after the fight.
Oh, yes.
When we asked Foreman about that, saying, what do you think about a Don King? What do you think about his role there in the Jamaican fight and also in Zaire? He would just repeat on camera, there are rumors that this is what happened, that King went over to my side of the ring after and left me the fight. It's not true. But, of course, if you watch that fight, you can see the footage of King going right over to his side of the ring.
Yeah,
we're left with this quandary of how do you follow up when this man's take And now his reiteration that his take is fact when you have the footage. You've just seen the footage the day before of what happened, and he's denying it. So we tried to find, how should I put it, elegant solutions to this problem. But after 3 or 4 times of sort of getting him to discuss Don King, the facade and this veil dropped. And he looked at the person I was with who was following up with these questions and said, if you ask me another question like that, you're going to be asked to leave.
Oh, wow.
And the look on his face, I've interviewed a lot of famous fighters, and including Mike Tyson. And I have never been as afraid as the look on his face in terms of what that man is capable of. And we're talking about a guy who's the same age as my dad. He's 65 years old. Still, the menace that was there behind that very simple, understated way that he said it, of just, that's going to be the end of this conversation, let you know what's behind it. And I think so when you say con man, I think he's leading his life in accordance with the good person that he's strived to be with that second career. I think he is a very generous philanthropist. He raises greyhounds on his property, which I don't think a lot of people know, German Shepherds. He has a huge collection of German Shepherds. He is a very active, productive person, even at 65 years old, and likes to help his community. And as I say, raise great kids. But I think the source of that choice to be that guy is something incredibly scary and dark that definitely was the fuel behind what gave him the reputation he had. And one of the things he said to me when I interviewed him that I thought was quite interesting is I asked, what was the difference between Foreman pre and post the Ali fight? I mean, former career and then the second career he had. Is he said, well, every fight I had in those early stages of my career, I never wanted to be there. I never wanted to be in the ring. I wanted the spoils of it, but I didn't want to be there. After I came back, every time I wanted to be there. And you can see it on my face. You can see that it's pleasurable for me to step between the ropes and get in there and fight whoever. I didn't care. So I thought that was an interesting distinction, and I hope this sort of just illuminates at least the little glimpse that I got of him of that duality he has.
Wow. Well, that is a lot of great inside information. And real quick about Teddy Atlas. I mean, he did write in his book that he went to a former fighter's house with a gun. He was planning on killing him because he switched trainers. So that's just the part about Teddy Atlas. And George Foreman, I think, is, as you mentioned, both good and bad. But I can imagine seeing that look and being terrified. So Kol Kavod on the guts to be in his house, interview him. We're at the end of this program. Again, we could do 5 hours on this fight. I can't believe we're out of time. Again, our guest has been Bryn Jonathan Butler. The book, everyone should check it out. You can get it on Amazon. A Cuban Boxer's Journey, Guillermo Rigondeaux from Castro's Trader to American Champion. Everyone check out that book. Bryn, I don't know what to say. This has been fantastic. It's the old school interviews we used to do together of an hour log, even though that hour was not enough tonight. We certainly appreciate the time, and all the best to you on your book and, of course, the movie as well.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this really was. Thank you so much, Bryn. Be well. We'll speak soon.
Likewise. Take care.
All right. And last point I'll mention regarding this fight is you never know how sporting events will go as far as winning and losing. At the end of the day, Muhammad Ali's net worth is $50 million. Not bad. George Foreman, $250 million. So sometimes the loser ends up being the winner. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this very special Sukkot program of Ali versus Foreman, the 40th anniversary of the Rumble in the Jungle. Stay tuned for a lot of great programming, a lot of great stuff. But that's it for tonight. God bless and good night.